Thank you so much, Wendy. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Goldie Byrd. Goldie S. Byrd is Professor of Social Sciences and Health Policy and the Director of the Maya Angelou Center for Health Equity at Wake Forest School of Medicine. At Wake Forest, she directed the Integrating Special Populations for the Clinical Translational Science Institute, and she co-directs the Outreach, Recruitment, and Engagement Core of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Prior to joining the faculty at Wake Forest, Dr. Byrd served on the faculty at North Carolina A&T University. There, she was chair of the Department of Biology, the Nathan F. Sims Endowed Distinguished Professor of Biology, and the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. While serving as dean at North Carolina A&T, Dr. Byrd founded the Center for Outreach in Alzheimer's Aging and Community Health, COACH, to bring resources, support, and research opportunities to underrepresented communities who suffer disproportionately from Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Dr. Byrd conducts research on the genetics of Alzheimer's disease in communities of African ancestry. She has a particular interest and focus on the inclusion of special populations for genomic studies in Alzheimer's disease. And for this state of North Carolina, she co-led the task force to create a strategic plan for Alzheimer's and dementia. Her work draws collaborations from universities across the country and from 9 countries in the continent of Africa. Dr. Byrd received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Mentoring in Engineering from President Barack Obama, and she recently received the Bink Winbland Lifetime Achievement Award for from the Alzheimer's Association for many years of work and inclusion for Alzheimer's disease genomics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldie S. Byrd.
We get this straight. All right. I'm going to stand down here so I can see my slides. Good morning. So good to see all of you here this morning. It's such a wonderful day, a wonderful thing to do. I am just delighted to be here. I want to thank Carmelita for the invitation today. I want to thank our team back in the back who is exhibiting our work, and Reverend Henry Edmonds, who is also a collaborator with the registry. So we're just delighted to see all of you here this morning. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. Carmelita said I had about 30, 35 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions. There's never really been a better time to talk about inclusive communities with Alzheimer's disease. I read somewhere just recently that there's been more progress in this space over the last decade than there has been in all the years before. So that means we're making significant exponential progress with regard to what it's going to take to end Alzheimer's disease. And I'm happy about it because it's wreaking havoc all over the world. It's wreaking havoc in our local communities and our foreign global communities, and we're all just elated to see some of the progress we've made over the last few decades, but particularly this last decade or so. So this is what we're going to do, talk about this morning. I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's disease in 2024 a little bit. I'll give a little bit of historical perspective, though, and for those of you who that's something you already know, please forgive. And then we'll do a little bit on Alzheimer's dementia, and then Alzheimer's caregiving. We were just talking about Alzheimer's caregiving and what that's doing to our families, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what all of us can do. So again, as we look at Alzheimer's and dementia all around the globe, what we see in these bubbles from the bottom to the top is that it's increasing. So it's not just the United States, it's everywhere, and some countries more than others. But in the world, we are really increasing because the number one risk factor is age. So we benefit then from having lots of research, lots of technology, lots of discoveries. But because of that, we're living longer. And then as we live longer, this disease or and condition will increase unless there is an intervention or a cure, which is our hope. So by 2060, we're looking at about 14 million people in the United States. Now, we all know that that's probably an underestimate because many people don't get the diagnosis, right? And even at death, it's not necessarily on enough death certificates. So this is what's being published, but this may reflect an underrepresentation. And so if we look at the things that kill us, like breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV, and then Alzheimer's, you can see that we're making a lot of progress in all of these, but the percent changes in AD is just skyrocketing, okay? And this came straight from the Alzheimer's Association. So this disease then has been around for quite a, I'm gonna take this card. This disease has been around for quite a while. Matter of fact, it was discovered in 1906 by Dr. Alois Alzheimer. And what Dr. Alzheimer described was this cluster of symptoms that included cognitive decline, hallucinations, delusions, etc. Some of the same things we're seeing today. So again, he discovered it in '06, but it's been around, I think, since the time of mankind. And when he looked at plaques and tangles, he looked at the brain, the pathology of the brain, he saw these plaques and tangles, same thing we're seeing today, even though we're seeing much more. And the person who was described in that discovery was Miss Augusta Dieter. And bless her heart, she was married to a railway worker, and he just described her like this. He said, she's not the same person I married. She has trouble sleeping. She gets lost. She drags sheets around the house. She screams in the middle of the night. She was in temporary vegetative state. And Carl just didn't know what to do. Now, the reason I bring Carl up is because, so he had her committed. The reason I bring Carl up is because there are a lot of Carls in 2024. And so part of being an inclusive community means we have to help the Carls out of the world, don't we? Yeah, we got to help the Carls out. And so he did the best he could do. So in these inclusive communities that we're talking about suggest that, yeah, we do great research, we do wonderful clinical trials, we make wonderful discoveries, but we should also be connected in our communities at a grassroots level. So in other words, pay attention to the Carls around you. Now, one of the persons who doesn't get a lot of credit for helping to discover Alzheimer's disease is Solomon Carter Fuller. Solomon Carter Fuller's father was born in Africa. He's African American. And he, of course, was sort of relegated to doing some of the autopsies in Germany. He went to school here in North Carolina at Livingstone College, an HBCU in Salisbury. So I like to bring Carl up because I want to invite you to our Solomon Carter Fuller Day, which we'll have in February, so keep your eyes out. Now, Alzheimer's runs in our families. First-degree relatives who have Alzheimer's disease have higher risk. And so that means these grassroots efforts that directly connect to our families and our communities, our faith communities, our community-based organizations, and just people in general, is a space we have to do a much better job with. Because our families are suffering. It's not just a person disease, this is a family disease, right? And then we know that loneliness with this disease is a real big problem. Loneliness in general in the United States is a big problem. So the Surgeon General came out with this report just a couple of years ago to tell us about loneliness. As much as we're connected with these phones and TikToks and things, we are very lonely people. So again, when we think about inclusive communities, we're talking about connecting and touching and making sure we are directly addressing this disease with people, people of all colors, people of all races and ethnicities, people from all levels of socioeconomics. You know, people are where we're going to make the difference. So this report says approximately half of adults report experiencing loneliness. This is really important because the shape and look of our families are different. And I'm not talking about people who don't have kids. I know that's what people see on TV today, but I'm not talking about cat women and stuff like that. I'm just saying in general, we're having fewer children, right? And our children are really smart and they're entrepreneurial, and so they're all over the place. So they may be in North Carolina, and one may be in California, and one may be in Iowa. So who's going to care for people who have Alzheimer's? And then even if there's a house full of people, this is a lonely disease, and particularly if we don't do enough good work around providing care. So we're going to offer some things with this talk. And then about 16% feel attached to community. So, you know, community can be anybody, right? Family or non-family. So this chronic isolation, chronic loneliness is really wreaking havoc. And it also increases risk of dementia by what, 50%. So it's something we need to pay attention to. And then our cognitive abilities decline 20% faster among those who reported loneliness. And we can be lonely with a house full of people, right? So we have to take care of our mental and emotional well-being. So Alzheimer's disease and about 6.9 million Americans have been reported in the United States, according to the Alzheimer's Association, 34% over age 85. So if you're 85, about 1 in 3 people, a little over. And then actually 12.7 by 2050, but we just saw even more by 2060. Most common form of dementia. And it's a health disparity, so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. And then again, primary risk factor. No cure, 2 FDA-approved drugs right now. There were 3, there was another one, but they took it off the market. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's talk about health disparities and where they come from. So nobody should have worse health that because of where they live or the color of their skin or, you know, their socioeconomic status. All of us should have an opportunity for good health, and that's what this is about. It's talking about inclusiveness, inclusivity. And of course, the United States, bless its heart, has more disparities than any other high-income country. So what are some differences that might contribute to these? And we all know these. This is just a brief reminder. Socioeconomic status, chronic health conditions, social and environmental disparities, structural racism that influence the environment, and then, of course, things like diagnosis. So if you look at disparities then in this disease, what you see is that there are certain groups of people, there are certain groups who have more Alzheimer's disease than other people. So if you look at age group 55 to 64, 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and 84 and beyond, out of the almost 7 million people, African Americans have the disease twice more. Hispanic Americans have it 1.5 times more. And then, of course, women have 2/3 of the cases. And this is really interesting because women are also more caregivers. So the same population that has more disease is the same population that is providing more care. So men, that's all I'm going to say about that. All right. So then how do we measure these health disparities then? Well, like this, like life expectancy, health care, access to care, geographic and provider differences. And we're in trouble with regard to providers. So when we talk about inclusive communities, and we're talking about all communities having equal opportunity to be healthy, we also have to think about our school systems and getting more people trained to be geriatricians and researchers and neurologists and folks who are going to diagnose all these cases. So we've got that problem. I'm not going to talk about that. I'll do that when I come back, Carmelita. Um, and then just lack of representation in research and clinical trials. Because when we have a drug or an intervention of any type, we want every community to be represented. So we're going to talk about that as well. So if we look at the United States, prevalence in the United States, this report came out just a year or two ago. Yeah, actually, it's in the new facts and figures, but the report was out last year, I think. So you can see then where the counties with the most cases really are in what? The East, pretty much, other than one county in California, and where? The South. So really, the southern states are in the stroke belt. And honestly, when we look at some of these health disparities, they reverberate from conditions in the United States and policies in the United States, particularly slavery, that pitted health against people, if you will. So you can see that North Carolina is not one of those states, but we have our share of cases. All right. So then what we know for sure now, and I'm really happy about this, is that what we do, where we live, how we pray, play, and behave are most important in determining our health outcomes. So when we think about structure and policy and practice and health, we've got a lot of work to do if we want an inclusive and equitable society. Because 80% of what we do and play and pray determines our health outcomes. Only 20% is about health access. Now, when this came out, that kind of blew my mind because we thought access to health care was the biggie. But what the science says is that all the other things actually contribute more to our health outcome. All right. Now, this is really important because according to the Alzheimer's Association, we have Alzheimer's disease about 15 to 20 years before we're diagnosed in that preclinical stage. So that means our lifespan is where we have to be inclusive. From the time a child is conceived to the time that child is born, the family environment in which that child lives, and on up are really important in determining Alzheimer's disease prevalence. Now, we need to make differences all along the life course if we want to be equitable and inclusive in communities around Alzheimer's. Are y'all following me? I'll slow down if you want me to. All right. So let's just look at this as one of those determinants because our wealth and health kind of are determined by what we're able to do. So if I need to exercise, drop my cholesterol, drop my blood pressure, I need a place that's safe. I need a place that welcomes people of all kinds, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic status, whether or not I'm in a rural community or I'm in Durham. Shouldn't matter. All right. So we were really excited when this came out, weren't we? You all have seen this before, right? If you've seen this, raise your hand. Okay, so not a minute, so let me just tell you about it then. So the Lancet Commission came out a couple of years ago, maybe 3, and said, if we do these things in early, middle, and late life, we could probably drop dementia by 40%. So I'm just saying the same thing over and over, but in different ways, right? Yeah, but the Lancet Commission said if we do these things in early life, that includes education, take care of our well-being, just overall good health, that we could probably reduce dementia by this. And this is why everybody needs to be what? As healthy as possible at every stage of life. All right. So then equitable communities then. So the United States is fortunate to have the National Institutes of Health, even though the National Institutes of Health gets on our nerves sometimes because in spite of Revitalization Act, it hasn't forced us to be equitable in terms of research and trials that improve life for people with AD. But it's one of the largest research funders in the world, and it funds most of the research here in the United States. So it says that, according to this particular study, our initiative for the NIA, which is National Institute on Aging at the National Institutes of Health, it says that minoritized populations have higher rates of dementia. We've already established that. We have worse outcomes. And we're underrepresented in research and clinical trials. So this particular program, and I invite you to just put in your Google sometime National Institutes of Health or NIH and aging or Alzheimer's, and there's just plenty of information there, as it is with the CDC. So this particular program develops and disseminates knowledge, promotes research development, builds investigative, but it engages stakeholders to strengthen infrastructure to improve the health of patients and caregivers. And I put this up so that it's just one example of how the federal government really has begun to take issue with Alzheimer's and dementia. It's costing the United States billions, and it will be $1 trillion if it's not there already. And so this is a huge business issue as well. So the United States is interested. President Barack Obama signed into legislation the National Alzheimer's Project Act. And then there have been others since then. I'm going to share with you about caregiving in the federal government in just a minute. How much more time? Who's keeping time? I'm not. Who's keeping? Would you just tell me when I have about 5 minutes? Thank you so much. All right. Again, this is when we think about different communities who have disproportionate Alzheimer's disease, African Americans and Hispanic Americans, and there are other groups who have disproportionate as well, but they have greater familial risk, limited health care access, later diagnosis, which is a huge problem. And again, remember I shared with you that people have Alzheimer's, really things are going on long before they're diagnosed if they're in the late onset Alzheimer's disease. So there are people who have what we call early onset as well. And so some folks, if you were to Google it, you would probably see people in their 20s with Alzheimer's disease. So there's the early onset and then there's the late onset. Most people are in the late onset category, which means they're diagnosed at about 55 or 60. So again, by the time you get a diagnosis, the disease has been going on in your body for a while, for years, sometimes decades. And so it's important then to get an early diagnosis when we see people who are exhibiting those signs and symptoms that we're all very familiar with. So these populations then who may have been minoritized, who may have lower socioeconomic status, who may be in rural areas, who may be racially and ethnically different, may get a later diagnosis. And guess what? The two new drugs that actually reduce plaques and tangles in the brain are designed for people in the early and middle stage. So these are people who have early Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment. So it's more and more important for us to pay attention to our loved ones and ourselves when we're exhibiting these signs that may not be what we expect, and get that diagnosis sooner than later. All right. And again, African Americans have the highest in the United States. And this particular group, less likely to be diagnosed, and certainly diagnosed early. And these are some of the reasons that we all pretty much already know about. All right. The good thing is, and as I present these issues we have in this space, I'll also present good things. So one good thing is that we have our Medicare annual wellness visit. And so that means we can get a cognitive screen. with our annual visit. That's a great thing. That's why I see some people taking notes. This is great. All right. So let's get that early, if we're exhibiting signs or if our loved ones are exhibiting signs. And this is why policy is so important, isn't it? Again, we don't like to think we're politicians if we're not. And this is, did anybody notice this is voting season? Don't. But it's important to know what people stand for, and it's important for us to become politicians. And who wants to be a politician? But we're all political, no matter what we believe in or who we believe in. So policy is very important. This is a policy issue. Got bipartisan support, which is great and unusual. All right. Caregiving is, as someone has already said, is a really big issue. And so this disease is a family disease. And often, and again, women have the disease more, and there's a lot of great research around that, women who have Alzheimer's and why women have it more than men. And some people like to think that it's because, women we're men to death and they die first. People say stuff like that, right? But that's not it. And they have more Alzheimer's, so that, women get blamed for a lot of stuff. But that's not it. Just the fact that they live longer. And so lots of research going around that. It really has a lot to do with the biology of women. But then women have a lot of physical, emotional, mental, and financial stress as a consequence of this. So these are some of the things that happen to women as we care for our loved ones, whether it's our spouses or sometimes our children or parents or just a loved one. Okay? So we need to take better care of our caregivers. And the government is doing some good things around that as well. These are the kinds of things that give us a lot of stress as caregivers. And so we do more of these things than any other disease, really. Getting in and out of bed and getting dressed and bathing and showering and feeding, to and from the toilet, dealing with incontinence. And what you can see here is that in the teal over at the end, you see that getting larger? Well, that's the segment that shows where people live when they have Alzheimer's. And more people are dying where? At home. And sometimes they are alone. And sometimes they are being cared for by informal caregivers who may not know how to do it. And so we want to encourage more support groups. We want to encourage, I see Helen Featherson back there who helps to create support groups and support for care. And there are probably others in this room who do that. And then there's this. This is another policy thing. The CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, created a program. I think this came out last year. Yep, 2023. Yep. And the Biden administration signed an executive order to improve how caregivers and patients are being cared for. And so now, instead of just a traditional path of getting a diagnosis and getting care, now where there's an extensive and complex opportunity for an extensive and complex navigation program for people who are caring for Alzheimer's. You should know about Guide to Medicare program. So while we have a big issue in caregiving, inclusive community says we need we just need an improved way of caring for not only the patient, but also what? The person who's caring for that person. And so this is, again, another policy. This is why we vote. Another policy. I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm just saying we need to know platforms and what people are doing. And then we need to make sure whoever our senators and congresspeople are, we are sharing with them, whether we like them or not, or voted for them or not, we're sharing with them what our needs are. All right. So then this is one of the latter pieces I'll talk about is disparities in medical research. Now, in order for us to to even know about GUIDE, there had to be a lot of research that took place. So this is one of the huge disparities we know about in and in the drugs that we're talking about. You know, the disparities there are just so striking. And it's interesting that the groups who are most bothered or affected by Alzheimer's and dementia are the same groups who are least represented in research and clinical trials. So sometimes, even now, if you go to the doctor, you may have to try out 2 or 3 classes of drugs before you get the right one, especially for those of us who suffer from hypertension. And one of the problems is we just aren't participating enough among different groups in research and trials. So as you can see here, percentage of people who believe medical research is biased against people of color. Well, the same people who have more AD believe that. So if they believe that, the likelihood of their participating goes what? Down. We got to do something about that. And then the percentage of people who trust that an Alzheimer's cure will be shared, you know, same people have issues. Okay? So we have to do a better job of being inclusive with all of these things we're talking about this morning. And this is around aducanumab and lecanemab. These are the two. Well, aducanumab is no longer on the market, but lecanemab and donanemab are. But these were the first two that showed that amyloid plaque, when reduced, causes good changes. And you can see that Black African American, 1.2% in the trial that created these drugs. And that 76.82% were white. And that's not too different from what we see across the board. So that's one of the areas that our team is interested in. And again, these are the two now that are on the market. These two drugs, I think they cost about $26,000 a year. They cause some brain swelling, some brain bleeding temporarily, and that's over. They are shown to reduce the rate of disease progression, which is different. So this is exciting in one way because, you know what, we haven't had disease-modifying drugs until these came along with aducanumab. We had drugs that helped with our symptoms like agitation or, sundowning and things like that, but disease-modifying that actually reduced the amount of amyloid plaque in the brain. So this is really exciting stuff, isn't it? To have drugs that actually reduce the pathology of the disease is huge. The challenge is that they were created with the participation primarily of one group. So that's work. If we want to be inclusive, we have to, that we is in everybody. My kids used to say, Mama, you say we need to clean the house. That means you all. But all of us have a responsibility to improve these statistics if we want to be an inclusive community to eliminate Alzheimer's disease. So again, when we think about drugs or therapies in general, we have to be inclusive, bottom line. And so we do work in Alzheimer's genetics to find targets, to understand if there are genetic influences that contribute to differences in populations, but also we want to find genetic targets that could be useful in finding drugs that might help with Alzheimer's. And so if you look at our work and the disparities there, you can see that there are few studies in this work. So Blacks are not even 10%, Hispanics just even worse. Okay. Again, these are populations that are most impacted and least represented. So this study actually expands what we know in these populations, and develops these targets for drugs. And so one of the reasons we're finding is when we ask people, what are reasons, and I apologize because the left side may be difficult to read in the back, but one of the primary reasons when we ask people of color why they fail to participate is that they're not asked. So again, if we want to be an inclusive community, we got to start asking, right? So um, this is our study. We want to be inclusive with our work, and we want to hold ourselves accountable. So a lot of people, particularly researchers, say we want to build trust. I don't know if we'll ever do that, but we can be more trustworthy. So that's what we try to do with our work. And so this is one study that we're always reminded of, and it was horrendous. And so, but we want to overcome some of those things. And thank goodness the federal government has helped us to, and the federal government was responsible for the Tuskegee study. But thank goodness it corrected some of its behavior and require us to be much more accountable. So we are in the United States as well as in 9 countries in Africa. We're looking for people. We're looking for 13,000 people to join our study. And so we want people to help us figure out some of the things, and particularly in these communities that are most impacted but least represented. And if you're interested, just stop by the table. And also, Henry is back there with our registry. And so, if you want to join a study, if we don't have one for you, join the registry. We'll tell you where some more are. All right. So, inclusion for a world without Alzheimer's. So, these are some of the things in summary. First of all, these are exciting times. It's sad, it's dreadful, and particularly and everybody in here probably has some relationship to someone who has this disease, right? Yes. So as hard as it is, these are still exciting times around what we're able to do, what we're able to contribute, and every single soul in here can contribute to an inclusive community to help us get to that place of a world without Alzheimer's. It's required inclusion. Understanding root causes of why. It's not enough to just say this group has more, that group. Understanding those root causes and really delving into, in whatever platform we have, why it is and how can we resolve some of the issues. And then getting into community. We do an incredible amount of community engagement work. That's where the people are. Getting to know our neighbors and our community-based organizations and resources that help people with Alzheimer's. We want more people to understand the whole person. Those things we talked about that are more important, well, not more important, that contribute more to a health outcome. Those are called social drivers. Those are where we live and how we behave and how much alcohol. We drink a lot of alcohol and stuff like that. We still smoke. So we have been looking at the whole person and whole health, including everything. And then we're stressed out. We're lonely and stressed. We spend too much time with people who give us headaches. We've got to do all of that. We've got to look out for one another. And then those research and clinical trials, we need improvement in that. And then we have to just become a champion, each one of us, in our own space, in our own place, whatever that platform is. Just become a champion, be aware in this voting season of what we can do together. And then we definitely want you to help solve the problems, whatever way that looks. And finally, the time is now. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd. Now we'll have a little time for audience Q&A. Any comments, questions for Dr. Byrd?
I was just wondering if you could speak more about the drugs that are being used for um, prevention of the disease, but they cause brain swelling. I didn't quite understand about the brain swelling because it seems like to me that would be something that would be a negative rather than a positive.
Thank you. Glad to have these young folks who can run around like that. Um, so there are two drugs currently on the market for Alzheimer's that actually um, lower the amyloid deposition in our brain, the plaques. There are two of them, the Kimbe and the Kisunla. They don't prevent Alzheimer's. They simply take an Alzheimer's patient that is in the early stages, and these folks get an infusion, I think maybe twice, one of them once a month, the other one's twice a month. And sometimes that does cause some brain swelling, some brain bleeding. It's temporary, but it does cause it. And sometimes it causes some changes on an MRI, so that some of the MRI may look a little fuzzy. So the question is, the second part of your question is, then why? Seems like that's a problem. Yeah, it is. It really is. But when you compare that to, and getting some relief or slowing that down for a couple of years, and you compare that to normal progression of disease, many people take that option. Now, if you look at side effects of Tylenol, it's a long list. Most of our drugs have side effects. That's just, and then unfortunately, we take 10 or 15 of them every day. Sometimes that can cause some dementia too. But those are side effects of the drugs. But it's a great breakthrough. And there are other drugs that are on the way, on the market. So you're absolutely right that these drugs do modify the disease itself, which is why they're so exciting. Because again, what we had before aducanumab was, we're just dealing with symptoms. So when you go to the doctor, you may get some Aricept or something like that. But that does not modify the disease. These modify the disease. That's where they're exciting. But they do have side effects that are temporary. But I probably didn't answer. I said a lot, but I don't know if I answered your question. What was?
Thank you. Thank you. I think I answered the question, but I would like to know if you'd speak more of, what is the results of the swelling, if how long it takes, and you know, if it's not temporary, like what is the effect of it?
So one of the things, so the question was, what is the effect of it? In other words, I think we're trying to get to, should I do this? Or so my loved one. So it's usually temporary, maybe a couple of months, maybe. It depends upon the person. One of the things these drugs just came out like within the last year. And so one of the things we don't have is good history about what that's going to do to us, because it just came out. And some of them, for some patients, is shorter than others. And so what is required when you participate in this clinical trial is that you actually sign up on a registry so that you actually participate in studies that answer those kinds of questions. So we don't have all the questions just yet. What we do know is that when people take these drugs, we see a reduction in the amyloid plaque. That's what we know. What the long-term effect of that bleed or that swelling, we've got to figure that out. And that's done with another research study or trial. Great questions. I love that. You can, yes, there are tests where you can actually see that. Absolutely. No, a great question. So you can, yes, so you can actually measure that. But 100% diagnosis is at death. But with all the technology now, you can come 99.9% close. Yes. Great question. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's another talk. I almost did it, but but the answer is yes. So we think of Lewy body, frontotemporal, Vascular is the most common after Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most common, about 67 to 80%. Um, Vascular is next, and that's one of the things we have to think about with these populations that have a lot of heart disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, sedentary lifestyles. But yes, absolutely. Lewy bodies, yes, yes. So Parkinson's, yes, absolutely. And Parkinson's, sometimes you will see Parkinson's associated with the dementias, and sometimes we say Parkinson's with dementia characteristics. But these are all related. And what we know for sure is that in certain populations, what you're going to see is what we call mixed dementias. So you may see one, two, or three of them in one patient. Yes, depending upon the symptoms. Scary. Yes, I don't know who was first. Yes. You decide who's next.
So thank you very much for that excellent presentation. You also mentioned early diagnosis. So many times we have family members who are exhibiting these behaviors. They don't want to go and get checked out. What are your thoughts about ways of helping with that?
All right. That's the hardest question I had so far. It's getting family and loved ones to say yes. It is one of the hardest problems because you know the loved one is experiencing something. And the loved one knows it too. But the loved one wants to remain as independent and healthy in their minds as long as they can. So they're going to hold on to that and they're going to deny that. And then if you ever get them to the doctor, they're going to be just as normal as they can be till you get them back home. That phenomenon blows my mind, but I've heard so many families say they struggle. And then it takes a little trickery. And Reverend Henry Edmonds is back there, so I'm not going to say lie to him. But it takes some trickery sometimes to get them to the doctor. Whatever you have to do, and I apologize, I'm spitting a little bit. I broke a tooth, so forgive me. But whatever you have to do, do it. Because the earlier you can get them, we just talked to some folks in Houston last week, and we had almost that very same question. What do I do? Does anybody have the answer to that question? I'm not sure I've got it, but all I know is you just got to do it somehow. And you got to take those keys so they don't kill themselves and stuff like that. That's a hard one, too. Because we're independent people. We were taught to be independent, to work hard, make a living, and then now you're going to take my keys. It just doesn't work so smoothly. Sometimes you got to get other people involved, whoever that person trusts. And that person might be somebody they knew 30, 40 years ago. Not the new pastor, but that one they knew 30 years ago, because that's just how the disease works, right? And so sometimes it takes that child who lives in New York, who only comes down home once or twice a year, but because they come once or twice a year, that's the loved one, and that one could get the parent. In other words, whatever it takes. Be creative. I said trickery. That's better. But you see the importance of that early diagnosis. And it just sort of depends upon your family dynamic. I don't have all the answers for it, but maybe that should be a study in and of itself. It probably is. I just haven't read it. But whatever it takes, get them there. I probably could come up with some creative things. But it does take creativity. I'm glad you asked the question because it is not easy. But you see the importance because all of us, and that might be you know what, Mama, I'm going to go get my cognitive assessment. I want you to just come with me. So all of you can get it. So I will just say, whatever it takes, get them there. Because the new drugs so far are for people who are in the early. So the earlier we can get them there, the better, not only a from that perspective, but also for the sake of the family. You don't have to lose the family home because there's an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So we call that protecting, not hiding from the government. We call that protecting your assets. Okay. So we may have to get those advance directives done. We may have to get those healthcare power of attorneys in place. We might need an elder care lawyer to make sure we're doing things legally and in order. But if we even suspect and we don't have those things in place, now is the time. Because there will come a time when that person will be unable to do, and they're going to hold on to that land and that family home as long as you let them. So there are just some things families are going to have to take a little bit more charge, and they are difficult to have some of these conversations, but we have to.
I'm just curious, when you talk about early to mid stage Alzheimer's, is that determined by how long the symptoms have been going on, or by blood levels or plaque levels?
And I almost put that slide in too, but it's usually by the kind of symptoms that are going on. Like in the first stage is what we call preclinical. And that's that stage where there's hardly anything visible going on. And then the middle mild cognitive impairment is the next one. And so you can begin to see some changes, but they don't interfere with daily living. And about 40%, I think, of the MCIs go on to develop Alzheimer's. And then mild. So it's really dependent upon their symptoms, what's going on in their lives. Great question. Thank you. I meant to put my heels on. I forgot.
Are you familiar with any Alzheimer's support groups for caregivers?
Well, Helen, you want to answer that question?
Thank you. There is one that's co-sponsored by White Rock Baptist Church and Duke Family Support, and it's available online. We only meet online, and I think if you contact Duke Family Support, and it's strictly for African American caregivers. And I think that if you join, you will find it very, very helpful to you.
But I think Duke Family Support have support groups for other groups as
Yes.
well. Yes. So there are groups for all groups. Yes. And thank you for asking that, because it's great to be in one if you have.
From a more general or a broader perspective in terms of even just outside of this state, other communities?
Yes. Yes, there are. There are several. There are several national ones. Yes. So Us Against Alzheimer's, and there are different groups. Just type in your Google, you can certainly find them. There are some that are for people all over the country. Great questions. Thank you. Yes.
I had two questions. Is there a correlation between cancer treatment all time? Also, football fan, so concussion all time.
So the question is there a relationship between cancer treatments and Alzheimer's? There are, yes. I can't tell you much about that, but there is a correlation there. So yes, there is a relationship between some of those drugs. And that's a big area of study too. I'm not in position to tell you much about it. But in terms of football, wow. Tua Tagliavoia was just recently in the news. He is the quarterback for Tampa Bay? Miami, thank you. Somewhere down there in Florida. He's had 3 concussions. brain sort of wobbling around in the cranium, right? And so they want to put him to the side a little bit, which they should, because what happens to football players and people who engage in pugilistic sports hits to the head. There's boxing in my family. And yes, big time. There is something called chronic traumatic encephalitis. Huge problem for people who get hits, constant hits to the head. Huge area of study. And, you know, it's such a big money maker that baby steps are being made to adjust for that. So we need better helmets, we need better plays to protect, and we're seeing that. We're seeing some protection. There's a book called Not for Long, where a football player is talking about his experience, but he's also a scientist. And at the end of the book, he asks, would I do that again? And he says yes, because as a scientist, he knows what that can do, not only in terms of the damage to the brain, but also damage to your psyche, and somebody telling you every play of life. So his name is Robert Turner. He has a study at Duke, and he's at George Washington already. Dr. Williams knows him well. We actually had him to come and talk because that is such a problem. And so when we think about our young guys, well, and a few girls play football too, right? And not only football, but what? Soccer and rugby. So there's a lot of study now on what these sports are doing to increase risk for Alzheimer's. And there's a huge link. So thank you for asking that too.
Gracias. Necesito intérprete, disculpe. Doctora, yo quería saber si existe alguna incidencia entre el tipo de alimentación y las enfermedades de Alzheimer o mentales. Lo saco a colación por un estudio que hace años se hizo en Colombia sobre la demencia y los resultados arrojaron que las personas que viven en las costas tienen menos incidencia de demencia que las que viven en el interior por el consumo de omega 3 en el pescado y en otro tipo de alimentos.
Doctor, I had a question on the correlation between someone's diet and the risk of dementia. In Colombia, there was a study where the people from the coast, their diet was different from the people in the mainland. People in the coast ate have more dietary supplements that contain omega-3 in the fish and the seafood.
Mm-hmm.
She just wanted to see if that was the case.
Huge correlation. Absolutely. I cannot stress enough what we eat, our sleep, stress, our everyday discrimination. Those things are huge. So we want to increase our we say Mediterranean diet or whatever, but those things that are more plant-based and fish-based and chicken-based and less beef-based and salt-based absolutely make a huge difference in terms of risk for Alzheimer's. Nothing else. They improve our blood sugars, blood pressures. So it's just so much research on that that's definitive. They make a difference, big difference. I wish I could say it in Spanish, I just can't. But absolutely, yes. Thank you for that. Yes. I can say gracias, though. Gracias for that question. All right.
Do you have any information yet on why there's so many more women or Hispanics?
So the question is why more blacks, more women, more Hispanics. And so these are groups that have typically been marginalized, and it sort of goes way back, and even now, and discriminated against and have had less opportunity for upward mobility. That's one thing. And then, even things like salt intake and daily allowances for certain things. If you look like an African American who came from West Africa, didn't have a lot of salt. Salt was gold. But then when they got over here, the daily allowance was designed for people from Europe, so their bodies could metabolize salt. So that's why you get drugs for different groups of people sometimes than other groups. And so understanding our history, our ancestor, and that whole person is going to help us become inclusive. So it's just a history of systemic racism, sometimes, some cases, a history of just not understanding populations as populations of people. And this is so exciting. This is another exciting area. I'm really happy you asked that question. And then in terms of women, and so sometimes because of some of those social things and historical social things, it has reverberated to where we are now. But for women, our physiologies, believe it or not, are different. And so the new science is saying that, our hormonal differences at different times of life may make a big difference in that. So it's not just that we're living longer, because that gap is really and truly closing. Men are deciding to take care of themselves better, and believe it or not, as hard-headed as they can be, they are beginning to listen to us a little bit more, right? And so that gap is closing, but there are physiological differences that are being studied. And hormonal therapy, hormonal changes is one of the areas that's being studied a lot. Yeah. Thank you for asking that.
So much, Dr. Byrd. And we're going to take now like a 5-minute break, a really quick break, and then we're going to transition to our panel discussion. So please go take a break, visit our information booth with our sponsoring organizations, and we'll be back very, very soon.